Across the country, this is the time of year that high school students are prepping for advanced placement exams on a variety of topics. And to help in that effort, we're taking a look at the AP U.S. History exam here on American History TV. Our two guests joining to help us, Jason Stacy is a history professor at Southern Illinois University, Edwardsville, and Matthew Ellington is an American history teacher at Ayala Hills High School in Chino Hills, California. They're also the co-authors of the textbook Fabric of a Nation, a history with skills and sources for the AP U.S. History course. Welcome to both of you.
Thanks for having us, John.
Jason Stacy,
yes, thank you, John.
For viewers who may not currently be students in the midst of cramming for this exam, explain why high schoolers take the AP U.S. History test and what it means for their future college careers.
Well, it's a great question, John. And, you know, I want to be clear that the AP U.S. History exam really starts out with the AP U.S. History class. And the idea behind AP U.S. History is to offer a high-caliber college survey for high school students who are interested in really stretching themselves. And let me explain what that means. When I teach my U.S. History survey class at the college level, it's not just the memorization of facts and the recounting them in multiple choice questions. Instead, I teach students to analyze primary sources, to compare different arguments that historians have made that are often disagreeing, and to generate their own arguments using historical facts and primary sources to come to their own conclusions. And the AP U.S. History class really enforces that kind of analytical skill and critical thinking to U.S. history itself. And so all those students who are taking the test this year have likely taken the AP U.S. History class with a U.S. history teacher who is engaged by the material, but also is really interested in their students wrestling with the material, analyzing the material, looking at old sources, and coming to their own conclusions. Now, the reason a student would take the exam is that colleges offer credit for a score on the exam itself. And generally, a passing score is considered a 3, 4, or 5 out of 5 on the exam. But different schools take different scores, and some schools don't take the AP U.S. History score at all and give credit. It's very much up to the individual universities and colleges themselves. But I want to circle back to the class itself. Whether a student gets a 3, 4, or 5 on the exam or not, there is value in taking the class, because even if they don't get credit for it, they're going to go into their own college survey having done the work of a college survey when they take the AP U.S. History class.
Well, we're going to wrestle with some of the material over the course of about the next hour or so. Matt Ellington, before we do that, this exam this year in 2025 is May 9th. How many students are expected to take it this year? And what's different about this year's exam?
Okay, well, AP U.S. History is one of the largest AP exams that College Board offers. Last year, about 489,000 students across the world, mostly, of course, in the United States, took the AP U.S. History exam, so we can figure roughly about 500,000 will take it this year. And that's out of just over 3 million total AP exam students from last year. So that's about 1 out of every 6. Now, students can take the exam when they take the course. Here in California, that's usually their junior year, which I think is pretty common across the country, though sometimes you'll have seniors, other times you'll have sophomores take the course as well.
Jason Stacy, we're going to show viewers a chart of 10 different time periods, and savvy viewers will note that some of these time periods will overlap. The first one is 1491 to 1607. Explain what these time periods are and what the AP U.S. History test is looking for here.
I'd be glad to, John, but I just want to take a quick step back. Are you seeing 9 time periods or 10?
9 time periods, excuse me. Go
Good.
ahead.
I want to make sure they didn't add one, because then I'd be in trouble. We'd be teaching into the future. So I know we don't want to take too much time on this, and this is the whole scope of the exam. But I just want to say to your viewers out there, especially those who are going to be taking the test, you can look at these 9 time periods to help you prepare for the test itself. They will serve as a kind of framework for you. So let's talk about that first time period, 1491 to 1607. The first thing to keep in mind about these time periods is that they're weighted differently. And so only 4 to 6% of the exam will cover 1491 to 1607. And so that's something important to keep in mind while you're preparing for this time period. And also, as you mentioned, John, the beginning and the end of those time periods not only overlap, but they're not round numbers. So they're probably historically significant. And so you could use the beginning and the end of those time periods to trigger some important facts that serve sort of like a framework to contain an entire time period. So when you see 1491, of course, that's going to call to mind immediately before Columbus arrives in the New World. And so there will be some material on the exam, at least there could be some material on the exam, of the pre-Columbian Western Hemisphere. So much of that material that you maybe studied at the beginning of the year, the Aztecs, some of the woodland peoples up in North America, the Incas and the legacy of their history, that could be part of the exam, and that pre-Columbian era is of some significance. And then you'll notice the end of the time period in period 1 is 1607, which is the very beginning of English colonization, that's the founding of Jamestown, that has any stability. There were some few attempts at colonization on the part of the English before 1607, but it's Jamestown that is the first permanent settlement, and it eventually becomes the Virginia colony. And so now you kind of have, between 1491 and 1607, a bucket in which you can begin to remind yourself of some of the big events that happened between that period. Much of that is going to be Spanish and French colonialism, specifically Spanish colonialism in Central and South America, but also don't forget the North American Southwest. We often think of American history as the history of the United States, which it is, but there are large areas of the American Southwest under Spanish colonial control, starting in the 16th century and running well into up to the 19th century. And so students should be cognizant of this period between 1491 and 1607, even before the permanent British colonies in North America. Now, John, I know we're short on time. Do you want me to talk a little bit about some of the other time
Briefly,
periods?
yes. Just what are the buckets representing here as students try to prepare for these different time periods?
Good. So let's talk about some of the significant reasons why we've got the beginning and end dates. So we've already talked about period 1 ending in 1607. Period 2, which is going to be 6 to 8% of the exam, covers 1607 to 1754. And it's going to largely concentrate on British colonialism, as well as the French and the Spanish, though we'll be increasingly focusing on what will become the United States. 1607 we already talked about is significant. 1754 is the beginning of what's called in North America the French and Indian War, or the 7 Years' War, when it becomes a world war in 1756. That's really the end of the colonial period before we start the movement towards the American Revolution and the creation of the United States. That takes us to period 3. That begins the time periods that are a much higher percentile of the exam, 10 to 17%. And those will take you up through period 8. And if we just look at period 3, 1754, takes us up to 1800, the election of Jefferson. 1800 to 1848 is period 4. That takes us to the end of the reform movements in 1848 with the Seneca Falls Convention. And then between 1844 and 1877, you notice we went back a step for period 5 to 1844 with the election of James K. Polk. After that, we're going to have the Mexican-American War, which will take us to the Civil War, which will take us through Reconstruction, which ends in 1877. Now, Matt, did you want to talk a little bit about periods 6 through 9 if we have time?
Please do.
Sure, I'd be happy to. Okay, so as Jason mentioned, some of the time periods actually overlap. So period 6 is 1865 to 1898. Both of those, of course, are specific years. I think we all pretty much expect students to remember 1865. That's the end of the Civil War. But because period 5 goes to 1877, that's an inclusion of Reconstruction, because that year, 1877, is the political compromise of 1877 that sees Hayes winning the White House despite losing the popular vote. Republicans essentially trade control of the White House for removing the last federal troops from the South and kind of really fully ending Reconstruction at that part. So when you look at the years are partly how College Board is kind of shaping a story or a narrative. So the narrative, the story of Unit 6 or time period 6 is a story of what we oftentimes call Gilded Age America. Post-Civil War, excluding Reconstruction, all the way to almost the end of the century, but not quite. So again, we've got a very specific year on the bookend, and that's 1898. So it would behoove students to know what happened in 1898. And indeed, 1898 is the beginning of the Spanish-American War. So by excluding that, what College Board is saying is this is the story of the Gilded Age, not Reconstruction, not the Spanish-American War, or kind of the expanding influence of the United States overseas. It's everything else that happens during that time period. And of course, probably the most important thing would be what we oftentimes call the Second Industrial Revolution, with the rise of factories and large corporations and the consolidation of wealth, these captains of industry or robber barons. And other major trends such as urbanization and increased immigration from Europe and the shift towards immigration from Southern and Eastern Europe, in addition to traditional sources of immigration. So Unit 7, or time period 7, also overlaps. That's 1890 to 1945. So again, what happens in 1890? And in 1890, the Census Bureau found that the frontier was now closed. Now, sometimes students get confused by closed. Yeah, by closed, what they mean is there's no longer a discernible frontier line. And to some Americans, including the historian at the time, Frederick Jackson Turner, this was very concerning because the frontier had always been part of the American experience. And so, in saying that there's no more frontier, not that there aren't undeveloped places, but because of things like the gold rush and the mining booms that take place across the West, there's this kind of hopscotching settlement pattern, so that by the 1890s, you can't just point at a line on the map and say beyond that is kind of the unknown. Also, at that time, we have pretty much all of the major Indian nations having been subdued through conflict and pushed onto reservation lands. So period 7 is 1890 all the way to 1945. So that's the story of the first half of the 20th century, starting with overseas expansion and imperialism of the United States gaining overseas territories, annexing Hawaii, Puerto Rico, Guam, temporarily controlling the Philippines and even Cuba for a moment, all the way through the progressives, World War I,
and it goes
20s Great Depression, and
it goes
World War
through
II.
World War II, and obviously
Yes.
period 8 here, 1945 to 1980. Just that final break there, 1980 is the end of period 8 and 1980 is the beginning of period 9. Why did they just split it up at that point?
Great question. And so what happens in 1980 is the election of Ronald Reagan. And Reagan represents, in many ways, politically a turning point, because Reagan is the breakthrough of the new conservatism, or the new right, which brings together various groups within the Republican Party, free market ideologues and Cold Warriors, social and religious conservatives, and we start to see a shift in American politics. So that's why College Board chose 1980 as kind of the turning point year. And then to the present, and I would just say for period 9, students don't have to worry about current events. It's unlikely that College Board would ask anything beyond, say, 9/11 or maybe the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, because beyond that, we don't really have settled history. We are still trying to understand the significance of the most recent events.
So with that sort of framework for viewers to view this exam and prepare for it, let's give them some of the examples that students might be asked about, those document excerpts that you were referring to. So I want to run through a few of them. And Mr. Ellington, I want to start with you. The first is a banner of the pewter artisans. It dates back to 1788. We'll show it to viewers on the screen. The text on that banner there, that blue banner that viewers can see, it reads, "The federal plan most solid and secure, Americans their freedom will ensure. All art shall flourish in Columbia's land, and all her sons join as one social band." What should students be looking for in this document here?
Oh, great question. So this is a document that we actually have in our textbook, and it's just a beautiful hand-painted silk banner from the time period. It is very much the kind of visual document that students could see on the AP US history exam. Now, they're not expected to have seen it before or know anything about it. So to start, this is a primary source. This is a document that is originated in the time period. So when students look at this document, the first thing that they're going to be drawn to, I think, is just the various images there. We have a flag in the top left. We have a crest on the bottom left. The top right, there's the banner that you just read, and then on the bottom right there is kind of an image, almost as if you're looking through a window into a workshop where pewterers are working. So students can look at that and they can see that here we have a group of pewterers. These are artisans, skilled craftspeople who are working, and not just working on pewter, but they're really celebrating their work and kind of who they are. With the inclusion of the flag, it's very clear that this is patriotic as well. And so after students notice that, they should probably look at the source line. This is what we generally encourage students to do, because the source line tells you what the document is, and it tells you sometimes who created the document and the year or the time period. So this says that it's a pewter artisan's banner, and it's from 1788. So let's talk briefly about pewter. Students may or may not know this, but pewter is a tin alloy that was commonly used to make cups and pots and teapots, as pictured there, and other kinds of consumer items. It insulates well. You can make beer mugs with it, and it's pretty affordable. Artisans, of course, are skilled craft workers. So not anybody can do this. You probably need to apprentice and learn the skill. And then finally, the year is important, 1788. Now, we don't expect students to memorize a bunch of years. And indeed, I'd be hard-pressed to tell you if you asked me randomly what happened in 1788. But students should be able to kind of put things there in context. And so 1788 is the early national period. We're post-Revolutionary War, that's been won, and indeed 1787 is the Constitutional Convention. So 1788 is during the ratification process. And it turns out that this silk banner is actually a banner that these artisans and their guild made and displayed during a parade celebrating the ratification of the U.S. Constitution. So there's a lot of information here for students to glean. If they look more carefully at some of the different elements, for example, the bottom right has that crest. We normally associate crests with aristocracy or monarchy and royalty. And yet when you look at this crest, right, it is a crest with everyday working people. They're not holding guns, they're holding teapots. And there's not a helmet on top, but there's a larger teapot with a traditional kind of shield in the middle. And so that suggests that they are celebrating the kind of not just the ordinariness, but the greater equality that is part of a larger kind of revolutionary ethos. Now, students also might be able to make some specific connections, and all of this can really help them kind of enrich an essay response. So for example, maybe they would look at the teapots and think, wait a second, teapots, that's right, Boston Tea Party, tea tax, tea boycotts. So it's entirely possible that the prominent display of teapots, both there and then on the image on the bottom right part of that banner, are a callback to that. And so that could prompt students to make the connection and talk about how these artisans, as they're celebrating their work, they're celebrating the kind of ratification of the Constitution, are also at the same time making a little bit of a dig towards the British.
Let me bring Jason Stacy back into this. So if that's one way to read a document excerpt that students will get, we've also asked students to send us their own questions related to the AP US History exam. So I want to get to some of them, Jason Stacy, and one is from Erica in the Nazareth area high school in Nazareth, Pennsylvania, who asks you, what's the importance of Jacksonian democracy in the Jacksonian era? What would you tell Erica?
Oh, it's a great question, Erica. It's important to remember that the Jacksonian era and Jacksonian democracy uses the name of Andrew Jackson, but it's not just about Andrew Jackson. And so when we're talking about the Jacksonian era, we're in period 4. We're at about the time period that Andrew Jackson was elected, 1828, but we can take that all the way to the end of period 4 in 1848 itself. And I'd say there's 3 big themes for you to keep in mind for the Jacksonian era. The first would be democracy. What is Jacksonian democracy? And each of these themes, for you to remember, raises some questions. So let's talk about the question that democracy raises. This is a time period when we have, for the first time really in world history, universal male suffrage, which means you did not need to own property to vote, but you did need to be male, and you did often need to be white. And therefore, democracy raises the question, well, why do only some people are able to vote, and why can't others vote? And so during this time period, you get an expansion of democracy, but also you have the curtailment as to some people can vote and some people cannot vote. And so while we talk about Jacksonian democracy in terms of expanding suffrage, it also brings to mind that there's a limitation. So let's talk about the second theme. Second theme for the Jacksonian, I would say, is reform. This is an era of reform where Americans begin to ask themselves, how can we improve our relatively new country? And it's during this time period that we get the Second Great Awakening, a religious movement that seeks to reform America in terms of temperance, ending alcohol consumption, and also in terms of abolitionism, ending the institution of enslavement of other human beings. And also the women's rights movement, again asking the question of democracy, why are only a few people able to vote? So we have democracy and we have reform. And a third theme I'd think of when you're thinking of the Jacksonian era would be expansion. This is a time period when the United States is expanding to the west, not the west we normally think of as west of the Rocky Mountains or even very much west of the Mississippi River, but into what we now consider the Midwest, through not only settlement, independent farmers moving out to the west, but also the greater expansion of transportation through national roads, through steamboats. This is also the era of Native American removal. The 5 so-called civilized tribes, the Cherokee, the Choctaw, and the Creek, etc., who were forcibly moved out of the southwest, southeast to the west into what will become the state of Oklahoma. And also, this is the time period when we begin to get the debates about the future of the country as either free or slave states, specifically with Missouri, when it applies for statehood in 1819, raises the question, will the balance of power in Congress be pro-slave or pro-free? And the Missouri Compromise seeks to answer that, settle it, though only temporarily. So really 3 big themes in the Jacksonian era: democracy, reform, and expansion. And they all raise big questions.
Matt Ellington, let me move this forward just a little bit to that 5th era that we were talking about, that 1844 to 1877 era. I want to show another document that students may encounter on the AP U.S. History test. It's a map depicting the Kansas-Nebraska Act, 1854. Viewers will notice a red line on that map. That's the line of the Missouri Compromise, which Jason Stacy was just talking about. But the blue states and areas there, territories, the free states and territories, and then the orange, the slave states and territories. What should students be looking for when they encounter this?
Great question. Okay, so what we have here is a secondary source, the kind of document that students could see on a multiple choice question or even on the document-based essay question. So first thing, of course, students want to make sure that they understand what the map is depicting. So as you said, we've got the free states in blue, the slave states in orange, and the red line that indicates the Missouri Compromise, which banned slavery north of that and Louisiana Purchase. But then there's other elements to the map too. There's that kind of peach or tan colored, those territories towards the west, and then there's also the green, which is the Kansas-Nebraska Act. And both of those are under popular sovereignty. So students want to be reminded of, oh, that's right. These two laws, Compromise of 1850, which brought California in as a state and kind of disrupted the precedent set by the Missouri Compromise, which had been that there would be roughly an equal balance between free and slave states. That law, and then of course the Kansas-Nebraska Act 4 years later, both of those have a similarity in that they introduced this feature known as popular sovereignty. And popular sovereignty is when the people of that territory, when it's time for them to apply for statehood, they themselves will hold a vote and they'll decide whether to come in as a free state or a slave state. It's a very convenient way for the politicians in D.C. to kind of kick the problem down the road, because ever since the Missouri crisis, that sectional balance has been a very big issue. So students should ask themselves what led to the developments there. That's what in AP we call causation, looking at the causes of that. So the causes of the Kansas-Nebraska Act are the need to build, the desire and need to build a transcontinental railroad to connect California to the Midwest. Now, Senator Douglas from Illinois wanted to facilitate a northern route. Southerners were opposed to that, but he essentially made a deal saying, look, if we open up the remainder of the Louisiana Purchase to popular sovereignty, that has the potential to expand slavery in a place where for decades now they thought it wouldn't expand. And if you notice, Kansas is right alongside Missouri. And in the process, that would allow those territories to be organized and would increase the likelihood of that transcontinental railroad being built. So students should be looking at what led to that. And then, of course, the other side of causation is what resulted from that. And so that's where students can connect the chaos that happens, the fact that what happens with the situation where there's going to be a vote in Kansas is that both sides are sending sometimes armed people into Kansas to vote. There's electoral fraud there. There is so much violence that it gets the nickname Bleeding Kansas. The Whig Party itself actually disintegrates over the Kansas-Nebraska Act, and what you have instead is a political realignment and the emergence of a new sectional party, the Republican Party, and their main plank is no extension of slavery. And we know that in 1860, just 6 years after passage of the Kansas-Nebraska Act, the Republican candidate, Abraham Lincoln, is going to be elected to the presidency, and that, of course, is going to then lead 11 southern states to secede and lead us into a civil war. So students need to be able to connect the map and the developments that are being depicted on that map with some of those other historical developments and show the cause and effect relationships between them.
Well, let me go from map to pie chart and walk a little bit forward in American history. Jason Stacy, want to show viewers this. It's two pie charts, the U.S. workforce by industry, first in the year 1870, and that's on the left, and on the right in the year 1900. What should viewers take from reading these pie charts?
Well, first of all, I just want to remind all the students out there that when you're looking at a document, look at the source line. The source line will have information that will not only help you understand the document, but it will inspire your memory of other material that you can use as an outside source in your DBQ. And so when you're looking at this source line, you can go ahead and read it for me one more time, John.
U.S. workforce by industry. 1870, the total was about 13 million. Some 6.8 million were in the agricultural industry at the time. In 1900, the total was 29 million in the U.S. workforce, and it was about 11 million, but much less of a percentage of the total number of those who worked in the United States.
Good. So when you look at the source line and you look at the dates of those pie charts, it should immediately call to mind that you're looking at about the last quarter of the 19th century. That should remind you that we're in the midst of the second industrial revolution during this time. We have cities growing rapidly, and we have large numbers of new immigrants coming into the United States to work in industry, coming primarily from Southern and Eastern Europe, moving into those American cities. And so if we wanted to use one of our historical reasoning skills, we could apply, for example, continuity and change over these two pie charts between the beginning of this period and the end of this period. And so when we look at it, we see some continuities between the beginning and the end. There is still a large agricultural labor force, as well as a large, though not as large, industrial force. And there still is some trade is a strong part of the American economy, a little bit of mining going on as well. But when we want to look at change, we can see an enormous change in the size of the American workforce. And that clues us in of those many immigrants that are coming in and are joining the labor force. And we can also see some changes within the proportion of those different kinds of labor that people are doing. While it is still a majority of labor, agriculture is still a majority of labor by 1900, it's begun to shrink. And while industry was an important part, though not the largest part of the workforce in 1870, we can see it's grown quite a bit by 1900. And so when we apply continuity and change, we can begin to see the historical situation here. These pie charts are representative of the enormous change of the last quarter or so of the 19th century, a period when there is change in the American economy, a change in American living patterns, and changes in American demographics, all reflected in these pie charts of the workforce.
From pie charts to bar charts, let me skip ahead about 100 years in American history here to 1970 to 1980. What we're looking at is what was referred to as the misery index, the unemployment rate being the blue bars on that chart, and the inflation rate in this country being the red on top of those blue bars. And it takes you from the year 1970 through 1980. Jason, Stacy, what should students be looking for?
So I'm going to do all the economics today. That's okay. I think this is a perfect primary source, in fact, to pair with the pie charts that we just looked at. Because in a way, we're looking at the beginning of American industrial strength. And by the time we look at this misery index, this bar chart, we're beginning to see what we call deindustrialization. So let's take a look at it. First of all, as I mentioned before, have a look at that source line. Make sure you understand the time period we're looking at. So this is a decade between 1970 and 1980, and that should be already begin to trigger students' memory. We're talking about period 8, and we're talking about a time period very different than we were talking about with the pie chart. And when we look at this misery index, which is a combination of both inflation and unemployment, we can begin to ask ourselves, using our historical reasoning skills, what is the cause? What are some causes of this particular misery that we're seeing during this time period? This terrible combination of unemployment and inflation which you've probably heard of in your history class, historians call stagflation. And that's a combination of a stagnant economy, high unemployment, and inflation, stagflation. And what are some of the causes of this? And we apply the historical reasoning skill of causation to determine it. And as you remember, this is the beginning of deindustrialization in the United States, when a number of industrialized nations who have now, after about a generation, recovered from the Second World War, nations like Japan, nations like Germany, have begun to compete with the United States, and increasingly we'll see American production move overseas, causing unemployment in the United States. But what are some other causes for the inflation? There are a number of factors going on immediately before this time period that might come to mind. For example, the Vietnam War, with military spending, injected a lot of money into the economy. That, coupled with social programs coming out of Johnson's Great Society, again, government spending tends to cause inflation. We also have something called the wage price spiral during this period, where as prices go up, wages go up. As wages go up, it causes inflation, which causes prices to go up. So you have this terrible cycle of inflation during this time period, in addition to deindustrialization, which is going to cause that both stagnation and inflation. But it's also important to keep in mind during this time period, you've got the Arab oil embargo of 1973, which raises prices of gas, which causes prices to rise generally, and that this decade-long stagflation, this period of misery, crosses political lines. So that if you look at its height, if you look at the bar chart again, in 1975, that's during the Gerald Ford administration, and it reaches another peak in 1980 during the Jimmy Carter administration, which probably cost him the election of 1980. So this is a period of economic stagflation, much of it caused by deindustrialization, that both political parties are struggling to find a way out of for the United States.
Well, as you've already said, time management's so important on the AP U.S. History exam. We've got about 5 minutes left here with you two gentlemen. I want to go over, before we end, sort of your last-minute tips for reviewing for students, and any tips you have for the day of the exam. Again, May 9th is the day of the AP U.S. History exam. Mr. Ellington, what would you tell students?
Well, first off, I would remind students that they know a lot of history. So don't freak out, make a plan, stick to it, do your best. So depending on when they're seeing this and how soon it is before the exam, if they've got a week or two, and this does air a couple of weeks before the exam, then I strongly encourage them to get a calendar and make a detailed plan. Look at, maybe take a practice test, do some self-diagnosing, figure out where they are, and then with that information and also looking at the time periods, and Jason talked about the weight. Remember, units 1 and 9 are the least important in terms of the test, only 4 to 6. Period 2 is only 6 to 8. The rest is 1754 to 1980. So combining their strengths and weaknesses with the weight of the exam, then make a plan and use your lecture notes, a review book, some study review videos, or other resources that your teacher has planned out for you. So make a plan, make it honest, something that you can stick to, something that's detailed enough so you have some benchmarks, and then follow through with it. If you're just a couple of days out before the exam and now you're starting to study, well, probably think big picture. Maybe reread the introductions for each unit in the textbook. Maybe watch a couple of longer form review videos from the College Board or some of the other high quality sources that are out there. And try to, and quiz yourself. Try to make sure that you can identify kind of the large themes. I mentioned, for example, the Second Industrial Revolution. So you would ask yourself, well, what do I know about that? Can you talk about that? Could you explain that to your mom? Could you list a couple of specific examples of laws or events or things that happened? And then when it gets to crunch time, when it's the night before, I think at that point you need to ease back and not worry about trying to cram a whole bunch more information. Instead, it's all about setting yourself up for success on the exam day. And then finally, when you leave that test, hold your head up high, because no matter what, you're better for having taken the test, for having studied and pushed yourself. And those scores won't even be available until July. So you can leave that and relax knowing that you gave it your all. And even if you didn't get a passing score, research shows that the students who took the test and prepared and tried, they pushed themselves. They're going to do better in college simply for the effort. So do the best job that you can, but don't beat yourself up.
Jason, Stacy, final minute here, final tip to students.
Final tip, keep in mind that you've been studying for this test the whole year. The whole class is studying for the test. So you've already put in the hard work. Don't try to put in the hard work the night before. Let the information kind of even out. If you study one thing the night before, that may be the only thing you remember. You've done the hard work, get a good night's sleep, eat a good breakfast, go have a good time, and remember, your success is having finished the course, and the test itself is a victory lap, come what may.
Jason, Stacy, and Matthew Ellington have put in the hard work in their textbook, Fabric of a Nation, a history with skills and sources for the AP U.S. history course. And Jason Stacy is a history professor at Southern Illinois University in Edwardsville, and Matthew Ellington, a history teacher at Ayala High School in Chino Hills, California. We do always appreciate your help, and so do the students, as we get ready for May the 9th, the 2025 AP U.S. history exam.
Thanks, John. Good luck, everybody.
Yes, thank you, John.